Hello and welcome to Global Issues and Answers. My name is Grace Aaron, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest today, Fagan Ginger. Anne is a constitutional lawyer, and she's worked to promote civil liberties and the United Nations for many years. Can you tell us, Anne, how you got started?
Well, I guess I got started from birth. I come from an English Quaker, Irish Catholic, Lithuanian Jewish, Midwestern socialist journalist family. So I obviously believe in peace and democracy. And my mother was an early member of the League of Women Voters and knew how to make a speech and on the Capitol lawn or to unemployed workers, and my father was a newspaper man. So I really have been doing this in a sense all my life. When I went to law school, I thought I would graduate and become a labor lawyer. This was 1947. And it turned out that of the 8 women in my class out of 150 at the University of Michigan, none of us got a job as a lawyer immediately, including the valedictorian of the class. In the end, we all worked as lawyers, but we couldn't actually get a job. So I worked for a labor union for a while doing legal work, but they wouldn't call me an attorney, although I was an attorney. And then I began to get clients, and in the McCarthy period, I had clients who were called before the Un-American Activities Commission of Ohio, and I must say that after only 8 years of hard work, I won the case in the United States Supreme Court in 1959.
Can you explain to many of us don't understand that whole thing of the Un-American Activities Committee.
Well,
can you define that a little bit?
Sure. They would subpoena people from all over the country. In this case, a college professor's wife who was very active in the peace movement at that time and active in the labor movement. They would subpoena somebody and ask them questions like, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Is your husband a member? Is your cousin a member? And if you refused to answer that question on the ground it was none of their business under the First Amendment, then you would be cited for contempt. And you would lose your job, and sometimes other things would happen. And in the end, often, those cases were won because the committees did not obey even the simple rules about who should be asking the questions.
So at least the courts, ultimately, were on the side of the individual.
Yes, but it took, in this case, it took from 1951 to 1959, which is 8 years. And so in the meantime, some people were deported from the United States, which is the same thing that's happening now. And many people were kicked out of their profession. The Hollywood 10 lost their chance to be writers in Hollywood. Many fine people were discouraged and kicked out of academia. So it was a very serious matter. And after doing that kind of work, I worked for the National Lawyers Guild for 5 years in New York, and we actually sued the FBI demanding that they give us copies of the files they had on a bunch of lawyers. And we won the case, and we saw the files, and we saw how inaccurate they were, that they were full of material that the FBI said was true and wasn't true at all.
So the FBI has been surveilling people for a long, long time.
Since they were started in 1924. And it would be interesting for people to understand there was a time before 1947 when there was no CIA. And the United States survived. And there was a time when there was no FBI before 1924, and the United States survived. So the concept of constant surveillance, which is what the current Bush administration is pushing, is not something that's inherent in this nation, or in my opinion, that's legal. And you might want to read people.
Yeah, which amendment is
Well,
that?
I would read the 9th Amendment.
9th Amendment.
Well, you might start with the First Amendment.
Okay, this is the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights.
Why don't you start with the First Amendment?
First Amendment, okay. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Oh, excuse me, I'm George Bush. If you're a Muslim, then I have questions about your religion. Go ahead, I'm just...
or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
And the interesting thing about the First Amendment is here were a bunch of revolutionaries who had just overthrown the King of England, and they already knew that after they established the U.S. government, there would continue to be problems. So people would have to have the right to petition for a redress of grievances in this new government. So they didn't think it would be perfect. Now read the 9th Amendment.
Okay, the 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
And many people believe, including the U.S. Supreme Court, that the right to privacy is included between the First Amendment freedom of thought and the Ninth Amendment rights not covered.
Okay, I don't understand that. Can you explain that to me?
Yes, the concept of the right to privacy is that you have a right to have ideas and not have the government tap your phone or tap your email or tap your internet. And that right, the right to privacy, grows out, the court said, grows out of the First Amendment right to have the ideas. And the Ninth Amendment saying if it isn't written down, you still have that right.
Oh, I see.
And the Fourth Amendment you might read because it's related too.
Okay, this is the amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects.
You see, that's what we're talking about, the right to privacy.
Right. Against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things
Oh, I
to be
can't stand this.
seized.
I'm George Bush. I mean, I'm going to have the National Security Agency. I'm going to do anything I want to. And the Attorney General is going to say it's legal.
So just to let our listeners, viewers know, we're taping this on February 9th, 2006. So if you're watching this, in 2009 or something, some of this may not be relevant because hopefully George Bush won't be the president, but
I think the concept of destroying the right to privacy is growing, and the concept that it's all right to plug into somebody's email or their telephone wiretaps. And there are two things that are wrong. One is I have a right to my own thoughts, as it says in the Bill of Rights. But the other is the information that they're getting is lousy, because they don't know how it is connected. If you look in an FBI file, which is based on telephone wiretaps and other things, you will find total inaccuracy. They say somebody said something about somebody, and the somebody who said it picked the wrong person. So they say they're talking about A, but they're really talking about B, and you can prove it. And they say that somebody said something, and you ask that person, you said, yes, I said all of that, but I put a no in front of it. So that the material that they are getting by wiretapping is not working.
And you know that because
I looked up
the FBI files, and there were tons of errors in them, right?
I've seen many FBI files, including my own. And I can show absolutely, page after page is full of things that are absolutely inaccurate, or half inaccurate, enough inaccurate that it comes out badly. And an interesting fact, we're talking about our book, Challenging U.S. Human Rights Violations Since 9/11. You might want to show it to everybody. And in that book, we have 180 reports of violations of the law, of human rights law, by the U.S. government. And we found very few examples that because they violated someone's rights, arrested them without a warrant, or held them without charging them with anything, or went through their papers or their email, there are very few examples of anyone who was found who actually was a terrorist. They've been held without bail, without charges, and no one has proved that they would have done anything bad if they had not been held. So that this whole tactic has terrified everybody, but it has not resulted in convictions in a court of law for a violation of the law. So you strongly believe personally that George Bush and the Bush administration are breaking many laws. Well, it isn't whether I believe it or not. We have 180 examples of a specific person whose rights were violated and who then had no recourse. I'll give you one example. The book has 30 categories of violations of law. One kind of... This is all the Bush administration. Since 9/11, that's correct, at the federal level, or local police who did what the feds paid them to do. That's all that's in the book. But the very first example, we're saying there are 30 human rights involved, and the first one is the right not to be killed or disappeared. And the example, which has not gotten wide coverage in the media, although we found it, was a man who came from Pakistan years ago to the United States as a legal entrant, didn't become a citizen, married a U.S. citizen, had a couple of citizen children, and applied for political asylum, because if he went back to Pakistan, because he was in a particular group, he would probably be killed. And they never paid any attention to his application. They never called for a hearing. After 9/11, he asked again for political asylum. And this time, they called him in, not on political asylum, but to deport him. And he said, and his wife said, if you deport me back to Pakistan, I may be killed. And so finally they held him in detention as a non-citizen. And while he was in detention, he missed the political asylum hearing, which they finally called. So they deported him back to Pakistan. And within 30 days, the political asylum was granted. The only problem was that he'd been murdered 2 weeks after he returned to Pakistan. And that's the first of 180 examples of violations of the rights of people who have been living in the United States or in U.S. jurisdiction, as in Afghanistan or Abu Ghraib or in Guantanamo. Mm-hmm. There are all kinds of rights. One is the right not to be tortured.
Yes.
And there are examples of people who have been tortured by the U.S. police, either at the state or federal level, and it has been justified by the necessity for the war on terror. And there is no proof that it resulted in anything at all except terrorizing that human being.
Yes.
Another example is stealing an election. That's not legal. Another is lying to the American people. That is your duty to tell the truth. And these are the kinds, very serious problems.
That George Bush misled, and the Bush administration misled the American people about weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq.
Right.
That got us into a war. That was an illegal act.
Absolutely. You cannot tell a lie to the American people as an elected official. And the problem is that this is the first time in the history of the world that one nation had the ability to destroy all life on the planet, either through nuclear weapons or through an ecology or environmental policy. It's never happened before. There's no countervailing force anymore to stop the U.S.
Yes.
Since the Soviet Union collapsed. I'm not sure that they could have stopped us anyway. They never were that powerful. But in any event, do you know how many nuclear weapons the United States has today?
How many?
10,700 is what I've heard.
It's ridiculous.
And of that number, 8,000 are on active ready alert. So if there were an accident and somebody pushed a button by mistake, many, many thousands and ultimately millions of people could be killed. Well, when you have one power, one government, one institution with that kind of power, then it seems to me the people who live in that country have to do more than they've ever done in order to stop mistakes being made.
For sure. I mean, it's our responsibility as citizens.
Well, that's right.
To rein in our government that's clearly out of control.
Well, and the problem is that everybody's busy. I mean, it takes 2 hours to drive to work, or 2.5 hours, an hour and a half each way. You rush all day in your job. How have you got time to be politically active at night? And yet, if we are not active, the world could be destroyed. And right today, people all over the world are dying because of policies of the United States government. They're dying in Iraq, they're dying in Afghanistan, they're dying in Guantanamo. And so it is critical that people, so what we do, we're saying we need to have a new path for action. So I got myself a red hat. Now, I can't say how this will help in any way, but I never had one before, and I'm using it as a symbol to suggest that whatever we've been doing, I never did this before, but if you continue to do what you have been doing, we will not stop the U.S. from going to war with another country. There will be a draft of young men and probably women as well. More and more jobs will leave this country. The shorelines will go down because of the problem of the shorelines will go up rather, because of the ice melting. All of these problems are real, and you can't work on all of them yourself as an individual, but you can work with people to see that something happens.
Yeah, it's absolutely necessary that people start to become more active in figuring out a way to change the government as we know it. Because it's becoming more corrupted. We're losing our democracy, something that took a long time to create and maintain. It's just going down the drain now.
Well, what's happened now is that George Bush says, because there is a war against terrorism, I am commander-in-chief and can ignore the First Amendment, the free speech idea. I can ignore the idea that you have the right to privacy. I can ignore the idea you have a right to a trial. I can ignore the idea that you have a right to habeas corpus, that if you're arrested in Guantanamo, you are still a human being. And he denies the right of that person to be told why he is being held, how long he will be held. And he does it because he says there's a thing called the war on terror. Now, I'll tell you a secret. There is no such thing as a war on terror. The word war means a conflict between two nations or two groups of nations. It does not mean a conflict between a nation and individuals. There's no such thing as a war on crime. There's no such thing as a war on poverty. These are imaginary words. So the reason to have a declaration of war, the president writes on a piece of paper, these are the reasons we need to go to war against these nations. Takes it to Congress. This is what it says in the Constitution. Takes it to Congress, and Congress agrees. That means that when these reasons are over, the war is over. If you have what you call a war on terror, it will never end. There will be no rules.
I think it was some comic said, oh, so George Bush thinks that he can accomplish getting rid of evil, something that Jesus Christ still hasn't been able to do. So it's ludicrous. It's how can we hope as a nation to get rid of evil? It's like trying to get rid of the color red.
Well, and that's not the job of the president. The job of the president is to be one of three parts of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. He is not the king. He is not in charge of the courts. He is not in charge of the Congress. And it's critical if we are going to have any kind of democracy continuing in this country. So we have another new approach, and that is through the United Nations. And a lot of people have never really thought much about the United Nations. So I wear a UN flag to make clear that there is a law which we've agreed to. It's called the United Nations Charter. I don't know if you've thought about it, but the UN Charter is a treaty. The nations got together after World War II and decided they did not want to have another world war in 20 years. And in order to stop that, they started something called the United Nations. And so the U.S. government helped write the words in the UN Charter. And those words are in a treaty. And under the Constitution, a treaty is the supreme law of the land. So that means the mayor of Los Angeles and the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles are supposed to obey the UN Charter. Governor Schwarzenegger, as well as the federal government. A treaty is the supreme law of the land. Maybe you can find Article 2.4 of the Charter is right here, and I think that that gives you a suggestion that the people of the United States are really unaware of the content of the UN Charter. And I think that it's important for us today, since we have all these nuclear weapons, to be very clear on this.
Yeah, okay. United Nations Charter, Article 2.4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force.
Now, just a minute. The refrain from the threat or use of force. I mean, I'm George Bush. Nuclear weapons are a threat of use of force. You mean to say I can't mention or we can't have nuclear weapons? Go ahead. Shall refrain
in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity.
Now, just a minute. I'm going to go into Afghanistan. Go ahead.
Or political independence.
Now, just a minute. I'm going to go into Iraq.
Right. Of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So this is U.S. law because we've ratified.
Absolutely. The President helped write it and the Senate ratified it.
Okay, so once the treaty has been ratified, it becomes international law, but also national law.
National law, absolutely. Okay. And that's a lot of what Meiklejohn is doing. And so our new approach is...
Okay, just a second. So this is Ann Fagan Ginger, our guest, in case you just tuned in. And she is with the Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute.
Right.
Now, can you explain what that is?
Yes, it's exactly what we're talking about. I started in 1945, and 400 young people have come there as interns, law students and college students, to learn about how the UN Charter, and there are a number of other treaties we've ratified, relate to U.S. law, something that they don't seem to learn quite the same way in law school. And so we try to help people use U.S. law and UN law in order to protect the rights of the people.
Because sometimes, so this is something that a good lawyer in a particular case, like for instance, are they using UN law in capital punishment cases.
Some people are, and I think it's effective. The fact of the matter is, the UN documents, another treaty we ratified called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we ratified under the first President Bush, 1991, says that capital punishment should be abolished. But you can sign on to it and ratify it if you haven't yet abolished it. But it discourages it. And one of the reasons the U.S. is now saying you can't have capital punishment against anybody under the age of 18 is because it's in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
I see.
So that we benefit from the fact that nations all over the world are struggling with similar problems to ours, except they don't have all the money that we have or all the weapons. And they have decided these are common issues. And by writing them into a treaty then, and all of us signing it, and then there's a process for enforcing these treaties by reporting.
So how does that work?
Well, every so many years, the United States government has to file a report with a UN committee, in this case the UN Human Rights Committee, in which they say, we're not breaking up labor unions, which in fact they are. We are not using cruel and unusual punishment, which then there are examples that they are. But that is what they have to do. They have to go through each of the articles and by the way, this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights talks about the rights of the child and the rights of the family, which were not written into the Constitution. And it says that the nation shall protect the rights of the child and the rights of the family. And they have to make a report saying what is happening about this. And then they go to a meeting, and members of the members of the committee, 18 people from all over the world, listen to their report. And if they say something that the committee doesn't think is true, the committee asks them about it. Or if they say we haven't quite solved that yet, the committee says, well, here are some suggestions. And the interesting fact, people don't think about this, but it's through reporting that we've made a lot of changes in our lives. As a result of the fact that many, many people were reported as having AIDS, finally the medical institutions figured out they better try to solve this problem. Until they knew how many there were, it didn't seem to be a serious problem, you see. And the same is true with child labor. Until you know how many children are working, you don't realize. Well, in the same way, if you file a report that's on all of these subjects, then you begin to see the depth of the problem, and then you can say we better do something about it.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm happy to tell you that, I mean, we don't always have good news at this point, but at this point, the United Nations is becoming more militant. They're not amused that the U.S. says what we do in Abu Ghraib is none of your business. Because under the UN Charter and under any logic, any jurisdiction that is within the power of the United States is within the law that the United States has to deal with. And so the U.S. filed a report with the UN saying it's none of your business what we're doing in Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo. And the UN said we don't agree with that. And so the UN appointed what they call a special rapporteur on violations of human rights since 9/11. And that reporter is going to make reports to the UN every year. Now, the U.S. media may not cover it as well as they should have, but nonetheless, the world will know that we are violating. In the same way, the UN Human Rights Committee that deals with this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is holding a hearing in March in New York. And Meiklejohn Institute is sending people to that hearing to tell them some of the examples from this book that show that the UN is not living up to its commitments.
Very interesting. So if somebody in LA sees a human rights abuse, like for instance some INS agency, typically
by that you mean Immigration Service?
Immigration Service, let's say using force or beating up people in their custody.
And this has happened. You're not just making this up. It's actually a fact.
Yes.
Yes.
So if you know, like, say you witness some abuse of people who are going to be deported or whatever, what can you do about it?
Well, we have two broad proposals. One of those is to send a report of this. And you could send it to Meiklejohn Institute. We're on the web, www.mcli.org.
Okay.
You send it to us, and we will then put it into a report, which we then send to the Department of State, because they're in charge of the report to the Human Rights Committee, and we send a copy to the UN Human Rights Committee. And that means that the Human Rights Committee will ask the U.S. about it when they meet.
Good.
And it actually works. We can prove that there are examples of issues being raised with the UN Human Rights Committee or one of the other UN committees, and as a result of policy changes. The other thing I haven't been talking about, and this does not relate to the UN, it relates to the U.S., I'm calling it OIG for fun. OIG, the Office of Inspector General. There is an Office of Inspector General in every single federal agency. And one of those agencies, as you said, is the Immigration. It's now called BICE rather than INS. But the Immigration Service has somebody. Here's the Immigration Service, and here's this Office of Inspector General. And if you make a complaint to the Office of Inspector General, they're not part of this agency. They're not even...
So they're just there to kind of report and watch the agency.
Well, and to deal with complaints.
I see.
And they themselves, if they see something that's being done that's illegal, they report it. But also if somebody complains. They complain to the Office of Inspector General of the Immigration Agency, and that complaint has to be dealt with in some way within 6 months. And every single report, a complaint that has any validity at all, then is reported to the chair and the vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Believe it or not, Anne, we're just about out of time. So I just want to tell everybody that we've been talking to Anne Fagan Ginger, who's a renowned constitutional lawyer. She wrote this book, actually edited the book with her institute, the Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute, and the website is www.mcli.org. And this is the book. It's a great book. It's really, even though it's more or less a textbook in a sense, it's pretty easy to read, and it's a very, very good reference because it gives a lot of information about the violations of human rights by our government. So it's very good. We have to sign off now. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.